Take the wheel off. You can use a 21mm socket. Take the lug nuts off. Remove the wheel. Take the caliper off. I'm going to take off the caliper and the bracket together. Use a 19mm socket. And remove the bracket bolts. Grab the caliper and just slide it off. Take a caliper hanger and attach it to the coil spring. Just make sure there's no tension on the hose. Now remove the rotor. If it's stuck on, you can take a hammer and hit in these locations. Just try not to hit the studs. Take a 12mm socket, take this bolt out. And grab the sensor. You might have to wiggle it a little bit. Back and forth. And slide it out. Set it aside. Take the cotter pin out. Use some side cutters. And just bend it back. And slide it out. Some vehicles may have a cage that locks the nut. Take that cage off. Take a 32mm socket and take the axle nut off. And take a punch and a hammer. Just make sure the axle is loose from the hub. And that's loose. The reason you use the punch is because you don't want to mushroom the end of the axle over. Otherwise you won't be able to get the nut back on. Take the cotter pin off the lower tie rod nut, or the stud nut. You can also use a pick. Just try to pull it through. Or the side cutters. Use an 18mm socket. Take the castle nut off. Now separate the outer tie rod from the knuckle. You can use a punch and hammer it from underneath, or a pickle fork. If you use a pickle fork, you're probably going to rip the boot and then you're going to have to replace the tie rod, or there's other types of removal tools that you can use. Or if you're going to replace the tie rod anyway, then you can hammer on the end of this. Take this cotter pin off, use the side cutters. Temporarily, I'm just going to take the tie rod and slide it into the knuckle, just so I can loosen that lower nut. Use a 7/8 wrench or a 22 and loosen up this nut. Once it's loose, you can take that tie rod off again. And take this nut off. Now we want to separate the lower control arm from the knuckle. You don't want to use a pickle fork because, again, you don't want to rip the boot. And there is other tools you can use that go in here and then push down on the ball joint. You can use one of those if you have to. Or you can take a hammer and give it a tap right here and try to break this free. There we go, it's broken free. Now take these bolts and nuts out. Use a 17mm wrench on the bolt and a 19mm socket on the nut. And just take these bolts out. Might have to rock this a little bit. Just be careful, this is going to slide forward. And just slide it out. Just lightly tap the axle. Slide the axle out. And just pull the knuckle right off. Now put the knuckle in a press. You're going to have to get creative with supports underneath the knuckle. You want to be able to push the hub straight out of here. use something like a socket that fits, or the proper tool to use to press. There is 2 snap rings. There's a snap ring on this side and also a snap ring on the back side. You can take these out with some type of a pick. Just get it out enough so you can get a screwdriver in behind here. And then you'll be able to work it back and forth. There we go. And just work it out. Just like that. I'm just going to take the front one out for now. Try to get this out without taking the back one out. You can push it either way. And then again, you're going to have to get creative. Find something that's big enough just to press on the outside of the bearing, but not to where the snap ring is. There we go. Just going to take a wire brush, clean up some of the rust on the edge. And a little bit of the rust in the groove for the snap ring. Now take the new bearing and find something that just fits on the outside edge of the bearing. You don't want it on the inside because then you're going to be pushing on the balls and the race, and that's not good. So find something that'll fit. And when it gets in there pretty good, if you had something that fits in here, that would be ideal. Or you can just take the old one once you get to that part and press it in with the old one. So that's what we're going to do. And press it back in. That's as far as I can go with this. Now I'll put the old bearing on. That's as far as it goes. And the old bearing might be stuck in there. Before I take that old bearing off, just make sure the new bearing's all the way down up to where the snap ring is in the back, which it is. And just take a hammer, tap it out. Take the new snap ring with some snap ring pliers. And slide that in position. That looks good. If you're going to reuse the old hub, you're going to have to take this race off, either heat it up and try to slip it off, or you might have to cut it with a die grinder or something. We're going to use a new hub. Slide that in position. When we're pressing the hub in, we want to support the back side because you don't want to push the race out of the back. So find something that fits on that race and support it by that. All right, that's all the way down. You can clean up the axle a little if there's some rust, and if you want to, put some anti-seize on there. And line up the knuckle. And just get the ball joint lined up as well. So you need like a combination between the ball joint and the axle going in at the same time. Looks good. Now we'll just line up the strut. Put these bolts in. And put the nuts on. And before I torque these down, I'm just going to get everything attached and torque it all together. Take the tie rod in and line that up with the knuckle. And put the nut on. And the lower ball joint nut. Get that started. Torque these lower strut bolts to 103 foot-pounds. Now torque this castle nut to 25 foot-pounds. See if the cotter pin lines up with the hole, and if it does, you're all set. If it doesn't, then tighten it up a little bit more until it lines up. Install the cotter pin. Just use some side cutters and bend it. Then just trim the excess. Now tighten the lower ball joint nut to 58 foot-pounds if you have the ability to get a torque wrench on there. If not, do the best you can. And if the castle nut doesn't line up with that hole, tighten it up a little bit more. And put the cotter pin in and just bend it using the pliers or your side cutters. Just make sure it's not hitting the CV boot. There we go. And just trim the excess. Put the axle nut on. Now using a pry bar in the studs of the hub, torque this nut to 203 foot-pounds. If you have that cage that goes over here, put that on now. This vehicle doesn't have it. And put the cotter pin in and bend the tabs. You can trim the excess. Insert the wheel speed sensor. Get the bolt started. And tighten that down. Just snug. Just gonna put a little anti-seize, nice thin coat on the hub surface. Take the rotor. If it's pretty rusty on the backside, clean that up with a die grinder or a wire brush. Slide that on. I am just going to put a lug nut on temporarily to keep the rotor on, makes it easier. Now take the hanger off the caliper and slide it over the rotor. Make sure the brake pads are spread apart. Put the bolts in. Now torque these bolts to 120 foot-pounds. Take that lug nut off if you put that on. And put the wheel up. Put the lug nuts on. Now I'm going to torque the lug nuts to 80 foot-pounds in a cross pattern to tighten the wheel down evenly. Just go around again, double check. After you're done this job, keep in mind you should bring the vehicle to a local shop and have it aligned. You don't want to have premature tire wear.